Hey, this is David Plotz, CEO of CityCast. I have a favor to ask before we get to today's conversation. We're doing our annual listener survey, and it would really help us out if you took it. And even if you took it last year, we'd be grateful if you took it again, because we can't use last year's data. Please go to citycast.fm/survey to take the survey. It's only 7 minutes long, we know, because we timed it. That's citycast.fm/survey. And when you take the survey, you'll also be eligible to win a $250 Visa gift card and CityCast swag, that great CityCast swag. citycast.fm/survey.
Hey, y'all. So another week, another huge Trump earthquake here in D.C. Now, while a federal judge has temporarily blocked Trump's grant and loan freeze, that has not stopped me, or probably you or your neighbors, from feeling overwhelmed with anxiety about things like mass layoffs or program cuts that might be coming down the pike. Now, this executive order is complicated and a little confusing, with wide-ranging implications for folks who live and work in D.C. And we want to hear your stories to make sure that we are capturing the human side of this story as it unfolds. How has your organization been affected by the proposed freeze? Or how are you reassessing your place in D.C. as a result? Or if you happen to agree with the order, tell us why. We understand this is a sensitive issue, and we will work with you to protect your identity if that's a concern. Leave us a voicemail at 202-642-2654 or email your voice memo to dc@citycast.fm. We'll be diving deeper into this story and what it means for D.C. tomorrow. But today, we're talking about a different political earthquake in D.C., this time in our local legislative body.
Mr. Cook, do you, on behalf of your client, admit or deny these specifications and charges?
On behalf of Councilmember Trayon White, Sr., he denies those charges and specifications.
Yesterday, for the first time since its arrest in August, Ward 8 Councilmember Trayon White delivered a defense to D.C. Council, through his lawyer, of course, as they fought against his expulsion from the body. And boy, was it a robust defense, full of so much legalese that it was genuinely hard to follow. But what was clear is that Trayon White is not going down without a fight, and that resulted in a super tense hearing overall. NBC's Mark Segraves was there, and he's here to tell us what happened and what's next in this spicy political saga. Today's Wednesday, January 29th. I'm Bridget Todd, and here's what DC is talking about. Mark, thank you so much for being here. I know we're catching you at a busy time. You're on the phone in between literal live shots. Thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Okay, so quick background for folks that might not know. The FBI arrested Trayon White in August and then indicted him on federal bribery charges. It'll be a minute before the trial actually happens, but D.C. Council has been conducting its own investigation and considering expelling him. And on Tuesday, they held their final hearing on all of this, where Trayon White had the chance to defend himself. Okay, so Mark, set the scene for us in the courtroom. Who was there and what were they doing?
Well, it's every member of the D.C. Council, lots of reporters, about maybe a dozen supporters of Councilmember White. Councilmember White's attorney, Fred Cook, who is legendary in this town for handling just these kinds of cases involving elected officials, and Councilmember White. I think the big moment came when Councilmember White walked into the hearing room wearing a black T-shirt that read, "The FBI killed Fred Hampton." So that kind of got us off to a start there in the hearing room.
You know, as a scholar of history, I have a sense of what he might be trying to signaling with that shirt. But what are your thoughts?
So long before this happened, Councilmember White had said publicly that the FBI was following him. He would be at events. Again, this is long before, more than a year or even 2 years ago, before the arrest. He would say at public gatherings, at events in Ward 8, that the FBI is spying on me. The FBI is in the audience here. They're watching me. And so, then here we flash forward to late last year, and the FBI arrests him. They actually were following him, at least at some point. So, there is that kind of dawned on me, that kind of flashback that he had been saying this before. And now, he's got this shirt on. I think he has made the case, and certainly his supporters have made the case that he's a target of the FBI, not because he did something wrong, but because he's a African-American leader in an African-American neighborhood.
His lawyer, Frederick Cook, delivered this opening statement. It was a little bit over my head, so much legalese, but he kept talking about this thing, BEGA. What exactly does that mean?
BEGA is the Board of Ethics and Government Accountability. This is an internal watchdog that was set up several years ago by the D.C. government to police the D.C. government and elected officials. And according to Mr. Cook, they have an open investigation into Councilmember White that was triggered by the charges against him. And that would make sense. That's exactly what their duty is, to do this. What Mr. Cook pointed out, that in the last 2 times that the council had ad hoc committees considering whether to expel or to sanction a member of the DC council, they did so only after BEGA had issued their own report, when it was Marion Barry, who had accepted some gifts, and when it was Jack Evans, who was accused of misusing his position on the council. BEGA had done their own investigations, turned over their findings to the council, and based on those findings, or at least based in part on those findings, the council moved forward with sanctioning Marion Barry in his case, and in the case of Jack Evans, preparing to expel him from office. And so that was one of the points that Fred Cook made, that one, you started this last year. You didn't follow procedure when it carried over to the second year. You didn't follow the internal procedures set up that BEGA is supposed to be the agency with the authority to do this. And you violated the Home Rule Act. So that was what Fred Cook was going after in his arguments today.
Is there any validity to those claims?
Well, yes, and to some extent, yes, he is correct. BEGA is the government agency that is set up and empowered to investigate this stuff. And in the last 2 times the council did this, they relied on a BEGA investigation to make their decisions. But the council hired an outside law firm to do their own investigation. They have the indictment before them from the federal prosecutors, and that's what they were relying on. And Chairman Mendelson said multiple times, the public has to be able to trust its government officials. And so that's why they were going forward without the BEGA report. That's why they were going forward, even though it went from 1 year to the second year. While there may be validity, and Mr. Cook, look, Fred Cook is a smart cookie. If I could make a pun there.
I see what you did there.
And he's been to this rodeo several times. He proved that today, that his in-depth knowledge of the DC Council and how it works, there's nobody who knows that better. But that is not going to stop the council from moving forward next week with their vote.
What was the mood in the room during this hearing?
It was kind of mellow. It was kind of chill. There was really not a lot of tension or heat. He has had these crowds, and I wouldn't even describe them as a crowd, but his biggest group of supporters that have come out for him in a public event like this was his first trial date. And that's when we saw at least 30 to 40 people, supporters, mostly Ward 8 residents, some clergy, who crowded into that federal courtroom for the first day that he made his appearance, the very first appearance he made in court. Subsequent to that, the groups of people surrounding him at these events has dwindled. And now what you had today, you had about 15 or 20 supporters. And then there was just one moment between Kenyon McDuffie, who is the council member, who is the chair of the ad hoc committee, and Fred Cook, the attorney, where they kind of went back and forth, wagging their fingers at one another, because Kenyon McDuffie had brought up the fact that Trayon White had refused to cooperate. He refused to testify on his own behalf during the investigation or today at this hearing. And Mr. Cook, took exception, saying, look, you can't blame a guy for availing himself of his constitutional rights to remain silent. And that's not fair. And McDuffie pointed out they weren't in a court of law. And this went back and forth for a few minutes. But that was really the only theatrics during the entire proceeding, which lasted only about an hour.
Is that why he has not really defended himself? That he's just like, this is not a court of law. I don't have to answer. I don't need to incriminate myself. Do you think that's why he really hasn't done so?
Well, I can tell you that if we look back a few years to Jack Evans, when Jack Evans faced charges and faced the possibility of being expelled by his colleagues, he did cooperate. He did sit down for hours and hours worth of interviews, and it didn't serve him well. They were still prepared to vote him off the council. He resigned before they took that vote, but that's the way it was headed. And so it appears his lawyers have advised him that there's no currency in cooperating or testifying before this committee. It was interesting to me that at the beginning of the hearing, Mr. Cook had one statement on behalf of my client: we deny these charges. That was the only time he addressed the charges. The rest of the case that Mr. Cook made today was not disputing the charges against Trayon White. It was saying that procedurally, the council had failed, that it was flawed, that they were violating both the Home Rule Act and their own internal rules because they had begun this process last year in Council Period 25. And according to Mr. Cook, by council rules, if you don't complete work in that council period, you have to vote to extend it to the next one. Again, according to Mr. Cook, that wasn't done here. He said it lapsed. His words were, this process has lapsed, and, you don't have the authority either by the Home Rule Act or by your own rules and procedures to go forward with this.
It doesn't make sense to me for the council to be both the fact finder and the review authority. I believe this process is defective. I believe the council needs to go back and get it right.
McDuffie pushed back saying, you're wrong, you're a seasoned attorney, but you're wrong. Chairman Mendelson pointed to some examples of where they do this routinely when business carries over from one year to the next year. But there was no defense made of the charges against Trayon White.
So our team watched the hearing. There was this tense moment that was kind of bizarre where McDuffie asked Cook if he was actually in the car when Trayon allegedly took the bribe.
I declined to answer on the grounds that the answer might tend to incriminate me.
What was that?
Yeah, so that was bizarre on several levels. One, what McDuffie says he was trying to put into the record was that you're allowed to bring witnesses who have knowledge of the incident at hand, right? And McDuffie was trying to make the point that Fred Cook didn't have that kind of knowledge because he wasn't in the car. He wasn't at the meetings with the government agency. He wasn't there when he allegedly took the bribe. Mr. Cook took it as an opportunity because they had just had this back and forth about the fact that Trayon White refused to testify or be interviewed, by the committee investigation. And so it was kind of Cook's opportunity to say, I'm going to exercise my constitutional rights here too and not answer your questions. I don't know, theatrics or posturing is probably the better term for that between those two.
Speaking of posturing, I know that White has been weirdly both kind of indignant and loud, but also very quiet about defending himself so far. Like, he deflects questions and refuses to answer, but then shows up in this shirt making a very bold statement. Given all that, were you surprised by the robust defense that showed up for him yesterday?
No, I would expect nothing less than Fred Cook putting on the best defense possible because that's what he's known for. He is a seasoned attorney who has defended, not just many elected officials in D.C., but many people over his decades of being an attorney. So I would expect nothing less from him. Councilmember White is represented by the Public Defender's Service in the federal charges in the criminal case. I could tell you that DC Public Defender Service is one of the best public defender services in the country. So he is getting very good advice. And at least when it comes to not opening his mouth, he's following that advice. But, the one time he did speak was at his swearing in earlier this month. And he apologized. And he said, I'm not a perfect man. And that was the most he said about the charges and about the possibility of being expelled since all this has happened. So he has maintained his innocence and denied the charges. But that apology was really the only really kind of candid comments we've gotten from the council members since this all began.
So it's looking pretty likely that White is going to be expelled. How are his constituents, the folks in Ward 8, reacting to all this?
When he was reelected in the last election, that election came well after the charges had been made public. So you have to assume that a good portion of the tens of thousands of people who voted for him knew that he was facing these charges and voted for him anyway. There was not any real opposition on the ballot. So in that respect, he, at least at the time of election day in November, he enjoyed wide support in Ward 8. If you base it on how many people are showing up at these hearings when they know the press will be there and he needs, kind of a groundswell of support, it's not a big crowd. It's always the exact same people. So what will happen is, we'll find out more in, about 100 days when, if the DC Council votes him off on Tuesday, there will be a special election for that seat, which he will more than likely run in that election. And we'll see if he is reelected again then and what the support is for him then. But I would be surprised if he didn't run, and I would be surprised if he lost.
I mean, I don't even really know how to ask this. I'll just put it this way. I'm a Black person. I know Black folks pretty well. I think stuff like the shirt and talking about how he felt that he was being unfairly followed as a Black man elected official, I could see some of that resonating with the folks in his ward. Do you have any sense that kind of messaging is clicking with people?
I don't, but you are right that for a long time, look, Ward 8, had Marion Barry, who they elected, even, after he had his personal and legal challenges over the years. And there are people who thought Marion Barry was persecuted in somewhat the same way, and certainly targeted by federal prosecutors who spent millions of dollars setting him up, in the Vista Continental Hotel all those years ago in that famous sting operation. So there's certainly groundwork laid for that generations before Trayon White appeared on the scene. And so it would not surprise me if he has a lot of support simply because of what you just pointed out.
Well, Mark, I know we're catching you on a busy day. Thank you so much for being here and for following all of this.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks for having me, and we'll see what happens next week.
That's all for today here on CityCast DC. And again, if you are affected by or have thoughts about the federal grants and loans freeze, please, please, please get in touch with us. Our contact info is in the show notes. We'll be back with that story tomorrow morning. Talk to you then.